great to see so many people out on a cold Saturday morning in Minnesota. My name is George Beck, and I am chair of Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections, which is a fairly new nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. And we are working to support the will of the people over the power of money. Our program this morning is also co-sponsored by Common Cause Minnesota and the Minnesota League of Women Voters. Each group strongly supports the reversal of Citizens United, as do over 80% of the American people. Copies of the Minnesota bills that have been submitted are available at the registration desk. So if you want to talk to your representative or senator about passing that, it's a resolution to asking Congress to draw up an amendment to reverse Citizens United. And you'll also find some brochures for the Clean Elections organization if you would like to take a look at those. We will be passing out note cards for questions during the program. Please write legibly. This is always something of a problem. We are fortunate to have with us one of the leading voices in this country on the reversal of Citizens United. That decision, as I think most of you are aware, has flooded our campaigns, election campaigns, with billions of dollars, and has created obligations on the part of elected officials. At least they feel that way. Jeff Clements was president of American Promise. He's practiced law for 3 decades in public service and private practice, both as a partner in a major Boston law firm and as Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts, where he also served as chief of the Public Law Enforcement Bureau. He is the author of Corporations Are Not People: Reclaiming Democracy from Big Money and Global Corporations. I brought my copy, and I have high hopes of getting it autographed today. Jeff also recently spoke at the National Unrig the System Conference in New Orleans that brought together 1,500 participants and the most prominent leaders of the campaign finance reform movement in this country. Jeff Clements.
Thank you, and thank you, Judge Beck, for that warm introduction and for all the work you and your organizations and co-sponsors of this event do. Thank you for bringing us together in this wonderful community space here in St. Paul. We had a nice event in Rochester last night with the League of Women Voters. This is an important conversation happening around Minnesota and around the country. As Judge Beck said, we have a big hill to climb to accomplish the goal that I think we all have as Americans of not only imagining, but of implementing government of the people, not of the donors and money and special interests. And we have that hill to climb because of the Supreme Court, the decision that Judge Beck mentioned, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, being the most prominent and well-known of a series of cases that really rewrote the Constitution. Decided that money was speech and corporations are people, and that there's nothing we can do as Americans to have reasonable limits on the kind of concentrated money, which is really not concentrated speech, but concentrated power in our elections. And so therefore we are losing our rights as citizens, as equal citizens, to be represented on equal terms, to participate in self-government as equals, because the money now dominates our political system. So we're here around the country because we're going to fix that, because democracy is on the line. American democracy is truly on the line, but we will fix it. It will take a constitutional amendment to do so. When the Supreme Court decides what the Constitution means, Congress can't just pass a law and disregard that decision. The states can't just pass a law and disregard that decision. If we tried to pass laws now that had reasonable limitations on outside money or super PACs or corporate money or union money, just to make sure that the people's voices were heard, that would be struck down under the Supreme Court's idea that that would limit free speech. So we need a constitutional amendment because the Supreme Court got it wrong. And so we're here to talk about how we're going to win that constitutional amendment and how we're going to make sure that American democracy, this great experiment in self-government of human beings who have equal rights, succeeds and prospers for another century and beyond. So that's the goal, and that's what American Promise seeks to do. And we have members and many allied organizations, and they're here today and here in Minnesota, like American Promise with Vicki Barnes, our state coordinator, and Common Cause and Move to Amend, and many others. And I have long have said it won't be just one organization or one group that gets this done. It will be, we will win this when we as Americans come together and work in our communities. And I hope to leave you today with very specific action steps that you folks here in Minnesota can do, and to help support those folks who are already doing this work here and help make Minnesota the 20th state to formally call for this constitutional amendment. 19 states have done so already. So the amendment will ensure we have equal rights as Americans, equal representation. We can't have that if billionaires and special interests have extra rights, have basically a right to use their power to get more representation, to drive what policy outcomes happen, to decide who gets elected. And it will make sure that we have a clear line between corporate entities and human beings. The Constitution is we, the people, and it was a very dangerous slip of the Supreme Court to kind of merge the notion of entities created by law, by us really as corporations, getting the rights of people, because it makes it virtually impossible to have constitutional rights be human rights that we can preserve against claims by corporations that they have corporate rights, constitutional rights, to disregard our laws as violations of so-called corporate speech and other rights. We need anti-corruption laws that work, and we need elections that have integrity, that can be trusted, that the voters feel like we have a voice in them. The constitutional amendment that we're driving around the country will help make that happen. I want to first tell you a little bit more about American Promise. I have been in this work since filing a brief in the Supreme Court case of Citizens United, and have worked with many people and organizations that are doing wonderful work to try to respond to that catastrophic mistake by the Supreme Court with this constitutional amendment. But we started American Promise in 2016, at the beginning of the year, January 2016, because we needed to be more unified, to be more strategic, to have a much sort of wider way of engaging Americans everywhere, cross-partisan, lots of different strategies being welcome to be debated and discussed as we move forward. And I have brought up a slide of Doris Kearns Goodwin, the great historian and writer. She's on our advisory council at American Promise, and she has seen the situation that America is in now in that historical context. And if you think about Doris Kearns Goodwin's great works, it's about Lincoln. If you saw the movie about the winning of the 13th Amendment or read the book, A Team of Rivals, she looks at Theodore Roosevelt. If you read her great book on President Teddy Roosevelt in that era, Lyndon Baines Johnson, she worked for President Johnson and wrote about his times. And each of those times were tumultuous. American democracy really opened to question. The post-Civil War, of course, where it was all on the line. We did 4 constitutional amendments in the Johnson years, between 1960 and 1971. We did 4 constitutional amendments in the Teddy Roosevelt days, the progressive era, between 1910 and 1920. We did the great post-Civil War amendments to renew American freedom and liberty for all, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to end slavery and guarantee equal rights for all. So my point is, we are in one of those periods now, and we have that historical perspective from Doris Kearns Goodwin, but I think we all feel it, that something has really gone wrong with American democracy, and we are in danger if we don't do that really hard work of constitutional foundation setting to renew again the American promise of liberty and equality and effective self-government. So don't despair when it seems really bad, because if you looked at when Americans rallied together to do and it is hard, you need 2/3 of Congress, we need to ratify it in 38 states, amendments are hard, but we've always done it in times like this, where everything's on the line and it seems to be failing, and Americans rally together to get it done. So that's what we're doing with this amendment. We're glad to have Doris Kearns-Goodwin on the team, and I have brought up a slide of some other of our members of our advisory council to emphasize something about American Promise. These are Republicans, these are Democrats, these are independents. There's Senator Alan Simpson, former senator, Republican from Wyoming, beside Mike Dukakis, former Democratic governor of Massachusetts and presidential candidate. There's faith leaders, there's business leaders like Judy Wicks and Ben Cohen and Matt Patsky, the CEO of Trillium Asset Management. There's Justice Jim Nelson up there, a Supreme Court justice in Montana who left the court after the Supreme Court of the United States struck down Montana's laws that it had for a century to keep corporate money out of state elections in Montana. He left the court and joined our board to get this amendment done to reverse that decision. We have veterans. So the idea of American Promise is, let's bring all Americans together. We don't have to agree on policies. We don't have to agree on parties. We don't have to agree on lots of things. But we'll stand together and agree on this to fix our democracy and win this constitutional amendment. So we do the hard work of cross-partisan civil collaboration and deliberation. That's our National Citizen Leadership Conference. Some photos there. We gave an award to Republican and a conservative congressman from North Carolina, Walter Jones. He is a big champion of this constitutional amendment. We had 4 members of Congress, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. That's Congresswoman Donna Edwards leaving the stage to, in another photo in the slide, Congresswoman Edwards was the first member of Congress to introduce a constitutional amendment in Congress after the Citizens United decision. We're a part of the Bridge Alliance. It's a network of organizations that commit to this kind of rebuilding of American democracy in a cross-partisan, post-partisan way, really, in a lot of ways. It's not going to be the same sort of two-party kind of loggerheads when we reform the country. It'll be a new arrangement that serves the American people if we do our work well as citizens. But in the end, it's not about the famous people or the members of Congress. It's about us. It's about the American people and citizens, and whether we can step up to this moment and do everything we can to win this 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So American Promise exists to serve you, to serve the people, to help us as citizens do well, to move this forward and do it locally in our communities. It's not about, asking you to support American Promise so we go get the job done. We want to know how we can support you so you can get the job done right here in Minnesota. And so we have what we call American Promise Associations locally, and Vicki Barnes here in Minnesota is our state coordinator and started the first American Promise Association right here in St. Paul. And we have them all over the country, and we have members in all 50 states, 150,000 people working very hard to help get this done. And the key is to organize locally, work with your own community, and trust and know that it is networked for maximum effect nationally. That's what we're all about. So why a constitutional amendment? We've talked about, we must have an amendment. Why is that? Well, of course, when the Supreme Court, as I said, decides what the Constitution means, if it doesn't work and we have to change it, there's 2 ways to do that. The Supreme Court corrects itself, overrules itself, as it did in Brown versus Board of Education, and deciding that separate but equal is not consistent with our promise of the 14th Amendment of equal protection of the laws for all. And Brown versus Board of Education reversed course. It took a long time before they did that. They don't often reverse their decisions, and there is 0 sign that the current court is going to reverse Citizens United. They are not going to do that, and there is no promise that this court is going to change in a significant way in the coming years to allow them to fix their mistake. So that means the only other way, if we want to change the current situation with how money is influencing our political system is a constitutional amendment so that we can enact good, solid laws that make sure the system works. And that sounds daunting, but that's what was intended, and that's what we've always done. This will be the 8th time the American people reversed the Supreme Court on decisions that the Supreme Court made. We sometimes forget the Supreme Court, of course, most famously in Dred Scott, decided that slavery is permanent in America, that African Americans don't have rights, literally don't have rights as citizens of America, reversed after a hard civil war and 3 constitutional amendments. But women did not have a right to vote according to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court decided that women have no right to vote. The Supreme Court decided a progressive income tax is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court decided young Americans, 18, 19, 20-year-olds could be drafted, sent to war, and have no right to vote. They make mistakes, and we, the people, are charged with correcting those mistakes when they don't correct them themselves in moments of where it's of such significance as it is today. So we've done this before, and we can do it again. Now, that's sort of why we need an amendment from kind of the Supreme Court and the way the Constitution works. But why do we need an amendment? Why is it of such significance that we need to do the hard work of an amendment? Well, many of you will know that the money is dominating our political system, and most Americans feel that they're not represented in the way that people who have a lot of money are represented. And that's just wrong, so that would be reason enough. But I want to share with you former Congressman Jim Leach from your neighbor to the south of Iowa, represented the people of Iowa for many years in Congress, and has joined our advisory council as well. He describes the Citizens United decision that struck down our campaign finance laws, and particularly the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the McCain-Feingold, describes it as genetically altering our democratic DNA as a country and pushing the country into corporatism and oligarchy. Now, bear in mind, this is now a law professor. He didn't, like a lot of people, leave Congress and become a lobbyist. He went back to Iowa to teach law at the University of Iowa. He served as the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He served many years in Congress. And so when a Republican from Iowa is saying we are in corporatism and oligarchy, I think we need to listen to that. Those are not lightly used terms. And genetically altering our democratic DNA is a serious situation. And that's why we are seeing the consequences of the decision. So what Representative Leach and so many others are talking about, why that is happening, what that modification of our democratic DNA is doing, is the money being driven. So the Citizens United decision was a key turning point. It wasn't perfect before that, but when the Supreme Court basically cut off the ability of we the people to fix it, things just got completely out of hand. So we now have billions and billions of dollars flooding into our elections, outside dollars, not from the parties, although the parties are also doing a great deal of fundraising and money. Now it can come from any source. That's the consequence of saying money's just free speech, and it can come from corporations or super PACs and no limits whatsoever. And that's what's happening. It's coming because it's now an investment. A corporation or a billionaire or a special interest can spend a great deal of money because it expects a return, not because it's looking for good civic contributions. It's investing in policy that will bring a return. $40 billion has flooded our election system since the Citizens United decision. And here's the key. This woman says, I don't mind you being rich, I mind you buying my government. The gentleman has a dollar bill over his mouth. Both of those people feel, like a lot of Americans, disenfranchised and silenced by the system. And the reason is not just the amount of money. It's, you can talk big numbers, and at 40 billion, you start to lose a sense of what that even looks like. The key is the money comes from a tiny, tiny slice of people and interests. So that means those interests that provide the money, it's an old story, the fiddler calls the tune, right? And the people who are providing the money are getting the representation, and there's very few of them. At the beginning of the presidential race, when most of the candidates were kind of vetted out, it was something like 30 families, literally, providing almost all the money in the system. So that 0.5% number that I have up there, 0.5%, accounts for almost all of the money in the political system. 0.5, less than 1% of the American population provides almost all the money in the election system. It looks like a very tiny sliver of where the dollars are coming from. Now, you hear a lot about certain billionaires, and I don't mean to call anyone out on any personal basis. You hear a lot about the Koch brothers, and the reason you do is because they spent $900 million in the 2016 election. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of influence. That's a lot of power deployed into our political system. But it's on both sides. They happen to be conservatives, but Tom Steyer is a liberal billionaire. He is the biggest contributor to the parties and to candidates in America in 2016. $91 million he contributed. And here's the thing. They're doing what the Supreme Court says they should do. If it's free speech, they're trying to speak. Of course, that's not actually what it is. But when we think about the dysfunction in Washington, Tom Steyer was quoted here in the slide I have in front of you as threatening to cut off the Democratic Party and stop the $91 million that he'd spent because of the shutdown debacle. Now, you may think, and most Americans, I think, would think, he was frustrated, like the rest of us, that they couldn't get their act together and the government was going to shut down. No. He was threatening the Democratic Party because they didn't shut down the government well enough. He wanted the government shut down so he could get his policy preferences through, and he threatened to stop the money flow. That's a big threat. That is how this system works now, and it's wrong. You wonder, why aren't they able to compromise? Well, this is one reason. Both sides have donors that don't want them to compromise. They have one interest they're trying to get, maybe a handful, and compromise is not what they're looking for. And so it isn't just undue influence. It isn't just that we don't have adequate representation. It's also breaking our system because we're not able to function as a republic where you figure out how to get a little bit of what everyone needs to get good policy and good decisions for the country. It's not just billionaires, of course. Sometimes you hear the misinformation that after Citizens United, corporations aren't really spending money in elections, and that was overstated. Not so. Corporations don't want to be known as spending a lot of money in elections because Americans don't like it at all. And so they usually use various forms of hiding the money. So 3 forms, just by way of, again, cross-partisan example: the Democratic Governors Association, the Republican Governors Association, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Just those 3 front groups alone, corporations and some unions, there's union logos up there too, funneled $700 million into our elections in recent years. $700 million through just 3 groups. So when you hear, oh, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is going to commit $50 million to the election cycle, or the Republican Governors Association or Democratic Governors Association are going to spend millions of dollars to help their candidates, they don't get that money from just the cupboard. They get it from special interests who want influence. And so there's some of the biggest corporations and biggest unions in the world up there on the slides, not just Koch's, but businesses we all know, like Microsoft and PepsiCo and Pfizer, are doing this. And that's a part of the flooding of our election system. Now, I want to emphasize, this is not anti-union, it's not anti-business, it's not anti-corporate. It's pro-American democracy and effective government, and business executives agree. Remember, we have business leaders on our advisory council. I've represented business in my career in some of the biggest corporations in the world. It's not about that corporations or business is bad, just the opposite. Businesses can prosper in effective democracies. And I want to share these numbers with you because business executives agree with us. Business executives want this reform. 85% of business leaders say the campaign finance system needs complete overhaul, and 75% define the United States as pay-to-play and corrupt. Now, these are people who do business all over the world. They know a system where it's frustrating to do business because you have to do payoffs and it's very corrupt, and you're in a country where it's not just competing, you have to find some government, pay-to-play system. 75% are saying that about America. That is troubling. And again, this is from the Committee for Economic Development that did this survey. 89% of these business executives say we need to limit how much money individuals, corporations, labor, and independent political organizations can spend in the political process to fix this. We can't do that without this constitutional amendment. So business wants this. Labor should want this. Americans want this. And there's good reason. We know it hits home hard. Everyone has their own experience of what our political system's inability to handle our nation's problems or our local problems, and the undue influence of some interests has. It could be whether it's our land, air, and water. It could be the way our economic system is failing to serve many people even as it grows. It could be where our investment goes in our cities and public infrastructure. And it's certainly about the future and what we're leaving the next generation. I want to just bring that home with a story that I talk about in my book in West Virginia. That's a picture of Betty Hara, a friend of mine now who I met down there. She's from Beckley, West Virginia. Beside her, that's a picture of Steve, her brother, who she calls Stevie, and his family, his young son and wife. Steve was killed in the Upper Big Branch mine explosion, one of 29 miners who was killed in that explosion. And not long after Citizens United, coincidentally, but in the Upper Big Branch mine in West Virginia, is a mine run by the Massey Energy Corporation. At the time, Massey had 60,000 violations of the Mine Safety Act. They were running a scheme to hide the unsafe conditions from government inspectors. They were paying off politicians and using the undue influence of money in the political system to corrupt the judicial process in West Virginia, to corrupt the political process. And as an independent study commission report on how the explosion happened, Steve and those miners paid with their lives for our failure to correct this deep corruption in our political system. 29 people died. As I said, the federal Justice Department came in because the state truly was unable to even manage the situation with Massey Energy's constant violations. They also had 13,000 violations of the Clean Water Act. So they were, as Robert Kennedy Jr. says, a criminal enterprise in many ways. The Justice Department came in after the deaths and prosecuted, in a rare instance, prosecuted the CEO, Don Blankenship, for responsibility for those losses of life in that explosion. That picture up there is Don Blankenship. He was convicted. He served 18 months. Now, that seems unjust by itself, that 29 men die and you serve 18 months. It gets much worse. Massey Energy was not shut down, it didn't lose its corporate charter, even though the law of Delaware says, and it was a Delaware corporation, says a company that violates the laws repeatedly should not have a corporate charter and should be revoked and they should be put into receivership. Didn't happen, even though that picture of Betty Hara is her going to the Attorney General's office in Delaware to ask them to do that and follow Delaware law. Didn't happen. Instead, Massey was purchased by Arch Coal Company, and Don Blankenship made $80 million after that explosion on the deal. He served his time, he's come out, and he's declared his candidacy for the U.S. Senate from West Virginia. And he's taken seriously as a candidate because he has money. That is what we've come to in America now. So we need to fix it. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was right. A house divided against itself cannot stand. as a country half slave and half free can't stand. It will not sustain itself as a republic. We are a house divided now. When Betty Hara has that experience and Don Blankenship has his experience, that's a house divided. You know, when most of us don't have influence in our political system and wealthy donors have undue influence, it's a house divided. So we have to rebuild the house. And the constitutional amendment is the foundation. There's many, many good reforms, and Minnesota Clean Elections and many others are working on those reforms. I saw ranked choice voting here today. Excellent idea and good reform that's happening in many states. There's so much good ideas, so much good energy in this country. People are really wanting to see a different direction. And we can do all those if we have a strong foundation, a constitutional foundation that can support them, can make sure they're not struck down by the courts, can make sure they reflect the interests and the wishes of all of us, not a duopoly of parties that are controlled by big donors, and not a system where most people are outside. To get that, we need the constitutional amendment that builds the foundation. It doesn't fix everything. It enables us to fix everything and start building the house again. So the amendment will do at least three things. There's specific language on our website and different language in different bills in Congress and moving through the states, and there's good discussion and debate about exactly what the words should say. Plenty of time for that. We are on a pathway to winning this in this decade, so we'll need to resolve those differences over the next 18 months or so and get behind one good, strong amendment. But pretty much all agree that it needs to do these things. It needs to allow us to have reasonable limits on money in politics. It needs to distinguish between human beings and corporations. Corporations now are just too big, too global to have it really be true that, you know, a teacher here in St. Paul is considered just the same citizen as Exxon Corporation. That's not fair. It won't work. We have to have a good distinction to fix what the Supreme Court has done. And we need to make sure we all have the ability to vote. One person, one vote, right? Equal access to voting and to be represented on equal terms. That's what the amendment will do. So how do we win this now? That's, I hope, what you've been waiting for is how do we win? What can we all do to make it happen? So the technical answer is Article 5 of the Constitution provides the way that all 27 amendments have gone through this path, and none of them were easy. But from the Bill of Rights to the 1971 amendment that gave 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the vote, they all came through the same path. 2/3 of Congress proposes the amendment, and then it's ratified in 3/4 of the states. And that sounds hard. When was the last time you heard 2/3 of Congress do anything? Congress can't decide when to go to lunch, let alone do a constitutional amendment. 38 states, that means blue states, red states, sounds hard, right? And it is. But that was true of all those other amendments too, and our strategy will break through those challenges if we do these three things. Stick together, and I'll say what each of these mean, but stick together. We have overwhelming support for this if we don't turn on each other and fight each other, divide ourselves like the media and our political system wants us to. But we have huge cross-partisan, independent support for this work. Act locally. Don't expect that, you know, some organization's going to go get it done in Washington and, you know, we can just like do a few things. We have to organize locally, act locally, and we'll network that all together to drive a different kind of Congress that will get this out. And so 2018 matters, 2020 matters, and I think we'll see driving towards 2/3 vote to propose this amendment shortly after the 2020 election if we do our job now. And that's why we have to stay with it. We have to stay with it in order to get to the point where we have the energy that wants this to happen to actually come together at the same time. It's sort of like, you know, getting everybody to the finish line at the same time, so it has that kind of overwhelming drive that can force Congress to do what some of them won't want to do, which is change the current system and get this amendment through. So stick together. I just want to back that up. When I say overwhelming support, is that really true? We're told we're divided. We're told Republicans and Democrats don't agree on anything. Yes, it's really true. Poll after poll since the Citizens United decision in 2010 shows the same thing. Every time people are asked in all sorts of times, hyper-partisan elections, war, economic challenges, all the things we've had over the last 7 years. One thing stays true. Americans hate the Citizens United decision, hate the system of money dominating our political system, and support a constitutional amendment to fix it. And so this slide shows, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, it's basically ranged from about 68% to close to 90% support for this. That's why we have to stick together. Let's not blow this, because we are already over the hardest part, which is national consensus that we need to do this. So some people may well say, and the good reason, well, what does a poll mean? What's really out there? So ballot initiatives over and over again demonstrate most people want this. 75% victory in Montana, in Colorado, in statewide ballot initiatives for the 28th Amendment. That's a photo of Werner Bertelsen, former Republican Secretary of State of Montana, who rolled up his sleeves at 94 years old to help rally the state behind this. And in his inimitable way, says the campaign slogan he was trying out was, "I've never seen a corporation I wanted to dance with yet in 94 years." And I guess it worked, because 75% of Montanans agreed with him. And, thanks to the work of so many people at that local level, many, many cities and towns have passed resolutions, 800 now, supporting this amendment. And again, it demonstrates overwhelming cross-partisan support. Paul Ryan is looking a little nervous there, I think, because 84% of his neighbors and constituents in his hometown of Janesville, Wisconsin, want this amendment to happen. And, he's the Speaker of the House. He could put it up tomorrow if he wanted, but he's not. He's participating in the current system, and he is not moving this amendment forward. And that's why we need to act locally. We'll be moving around the country, and I hope you will join in this effort, to ask every candidate of every party to pledge to support this amendment and answer that question. You ask them, ask your candidates, will you pledge to support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, get big money out of politics? Yes or no? And engage them. If they need more information, we've got it. But get a yes or no, and then the voters can decide. If 84% of Janesville voters had a straight answer from Speaker of the House on where he stood, that might well matter to Paul Ryan. He needs to know that his neighbors and constituents want this done. So that's why locally, and that's why we have such deep cross-partisan support. This is a quote from our American Promise members in Wyoming, again, a deep red state that has 250 volunteers out there working. Former Senator, as I said, Alan Simpson, Republican, on our advisory council, helping to lead that effort. And they are a remarkable group of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans who are working together. And they've been profiled in the press quite a bit out there, because it's so unusual that Americans are doing this kind of work across partisan lines. And I think this quote is really important. It's not about sort of mushy, meet in the middle, pretend you don't have strong views, and pretend that elections don't matter, or that partisan views don't reflect real issues that we care about deeply. We do. And the idea of American Promise is, yeah, sure, keep your strong-held views, keep your hard work for the candidates you like, but then come to this work and work with people who have very different views and support very different candidates. And that's why they say, we don't check our political affiliations at the door, but we're a cross-section of parties and people who know that our communities are better when we talk to each other, we learn from each other, and then we work together on the place where we do agree. So that's why stick together. Act locally. We saw a bit of that in Janesville, Wisconsin, as I mentioned, and our American Promise associations, and any other form of acting locally helps move this forward. So we have associations, other groups can do this too, but it's always better, and when I get to stick with it, it helps you stick with it when you're doing it with neighbors and friends. So our American Promise associations all over the country, our volunteers in places like Wyoming and Florida, Ohio, they don't just go out and gather signatures. They do that, but they meet together, learn from each other. They do potlucks. They do things that help them not only have fun with this and build community with it, but stay with it over time. And that's when we really begin to make progress in America. We don't have those places in the same way that we used to, and we need to, because we need this campaign to be everywhere all at once. It can't be top down. It has to be in all sorts of communities all across the country. And the way we've always done that effectively is through these sort of networks that actually are about the issue that we're trying to achieve, but also about sustaining us in the hard work of being good citizens in this country. So acting locally is an important strategy, and it works. Look at the work over time. When we started this after Citizens United, there was one state that passed a resolution. When it got going, as I said, Congresswoman Edwards introduced the First Amendment. 25 cities and towns started passing resolutions. Now, 8 years later, 800 cities and towns, 19 states, again, red states, blue states, have made, through that local action, 49 senators are now in favor of this constitutional amendment. We need 67, remember. It's not just 51. We need 67, but it's working. 170 representatives. We'll need 290. But this is extraordinary progress, and probably the most underreported story in American politics is this movement for this constitutional amendment that is historic and the kind of reform that lasts. And it's not the typical narrative that the media wants to give us of we're so divided and we're so checked out or disillusioned, or all the things they tell us that really make us feel like it's hopeless. It's happening, and it's making significant progress. So right here in Minnesota, there's a lot you can do. Thanks to Senator John Marty and Representative Ray Dean, we have a bill in Minnesota that could make Minnesota be the 20th state to call for this amendment. The House version is 2139. The Senate version is 1082. We need to support these, and that will help move this forward. So what else can you do? How can you help move this forward? Act locally, as I said, but we also have very good materials at americanpromise.net, as in network, americanpromise.net. And we have a Take Action tab at the top. And we have things you can do any day you want. You get up in the morning and you say, maybe I'll have a moment to help win the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Click on what can you do today. You can fire off a letter to the editor with our technology that makes that very simple. You can fire off a letter to your member of Congress, and then you can fire off a letter or a phone call to ask your representative in the legislature here to support that bill that would make Minnesota the 20th state to support the amendment. And then you can go to work, and have already done a great thing for the country. Now, we also have ways to go deeper. You can get involved in your community, and there's lots of information. Each of these boxes you see on the slide, you can click on, and it opens up a whole menu of things. And then start an APA means start an American Promise Association. I'd urge you to talk to Vicki Barnes. She's going to be talking at the end of this about plugging into the American Promise Association and the work right here. And that goes a little deeper and begins to organize to carry this forward in Minnesota for some time. Now, staying with it. That's obvious, but it's not staying with it, for 50 years, so we do this sometime in the future. It's staying with it for the next election cycle or two so that we can drive that proposed amendment out of Congress and get it on its road to the ratification pathway in the states. And I'd encourage you to stay with it by looking at this graph. I started in sort of 2010, like a lot of people, and we didn't have much at all to show for progress. We just started. But people believed, We believed that this could happen. We believed in the good faith and the patriotism, really, of Americans. We believed that Americans believed in our promise of what our country should be and would respond. And we made that kind of progress, whether it's measured by states or whether measured by the Senate support towards the 67 we'll need. We've made consistent, and now from a perspective of a few years later, dramatic progress. Vicki Barnes started this. Vicki Barnes here in St. Paul just about 5 years ago, and has been working diligently and hard like so many other people. And if she just looked at the graph, it's only got a few states, it doesn't have too many senators, you might get discouraged. But she stuck with it, and look where we are now. So we're halfway there, and we stick with this, and we bring more people to this. We're going to get ratification of this amendment, not in a couple generations. We're going to do it now for our kids, for the next generation, and say, all right, we've handed you a boatload of problems, whether debt, climate, war, you name it. But we've also handed you a constitutional foundation that will help you be able to solve the problems in your generation better than we've been able to do. So when we do that, we'll have a big party, we'll celebrate, and we'll believe that, in the future of America again. And I put this slide up because these are people who won amendments. These are the parties. These are the after it's done faces. You don't see many smiles like this in American politics these days. This works. Americans know how to do this, even though it's hard. Whether freeing the slaves and guaranteeing equal rights, regardless of race, and ending poll taxes, which stop people from being able to vote based on their money and race, and getting women the right to vote, lowering the voting age to 18. All of these things we did. And you don't see a single politician who's well known in these pictures. You just see Americans, American citizens. That's how amendments work. It's when the political system doesn't work anymore and we have to do it ourselves. So my favorite celebration picture might well be Happy Days Are Beer Again. That's the repeal of Prohibition with the 21st Amendment. And when we win this one, we'll have Happy Days beer again. And there's a brewery right over here across from this studio you may have seen, so we can already have our victory party planned out. But first we have to get to work. So we'll talk more about this, and Vicki will come up. But join American Promise. We're a member organization. We aren't driven by huge donors and things like that. We're driven by an average contribution of $30 from lots and lots of Americans. And that's how we're going to be able to scale this and sustain this. So please join American Promise at americanpromise.net. Take the kinds of actions I mentioned. Sign up to get the pledge campaign going, so all your candidates hear from us about us wanting them to say where do they stand on this. Help out Vicki and in the state here, and consider joining an American Promise Association. And then save the date for our big national conference. It's June 22nd. It'll be in Washington, D.C. We'll have all kinds of great speakers, well-known speakers. We'll have 500 Americans from every state, and we're going to, after 2 days of networking, learning, inspiration, on Monday, June 25th, go up to Capitol Hill in a well-organized, effective citizen lobbying day for this amendment. So it's a very important conference. I know you'll get a lot out of it if you consider joining. You have on your chair, save the date about the conference, so you have that with you. It's also on our website at americanpromise.net, and that also has a part on the forms you have with you, participation forms, where you can sign up, you can join American Promise. You can also check a box if you want to get involved in an American Promise Association. You don't have to know everything about what that might entail. It's not a commitment. It's an invitation to talk further about what that might involve and whether it matches how you want to get involved in this. So do please fill out the form, no matter at what level you decide to participate, and give it to Vicki Barnes, who will be up here at the end to say a bit more, and we'll follow up with you. So let's get this done. I hope you're in to join this effort, and look forward to working with you. And thank you so much for being here and for all the good work you do here in St. Paul. I think Judge Beck is going to come back and help us moderate some questions, and I look forward to the continued conversation.
There are so many organizations working to reverse Citizens United. Why can't they get together?
It's true. There are a lot of organizations. I would say there aren't enough yet. I was often asked that very question when we started. I was asked that question when we started in January 2016 with a new organization, American Promise. Why do we need more organizations? You know, de Tocqueville used to talk about, when he wrote his great book about democracy in America in the 1800s, the weird compulsion Americans had to form groups. And I think it's actually very healthy. It's not weird, and he didn't think it was weird. He was fascinated by that's how self-government and democracy works and how freedom and liberty work. That we are not monolithic, one group will serve all people in all the different ways we want to get this done. We are a democracy, and effective self-government is actually more like an ecosystem. Think of the diversity of a healthy ecosystem where there's lots of different things happening. It's a systemic problem we have, and an amendment is a systemic solution. And so I think the groups are actually much more aligned and unified than they've been in 8 years of this work. When we did our first National Citizen Leadership Conference in the end of 2016, after we'd started, it was the first time anybody had brought all the different groups and leaders together who are doing this work for conversation, strategizing, planning. And you mentioned, Judge, the Unrigged Summit in New Orleans, where we had 1,500 people meeting and gathering many, many different groups. That's a healthy thing. That's not something to bemoan. Find the one that works for you, get involved, and then there'll be opportunities for these coalitions and these networks of groups, and that's when it really begins to take off. So I hope American Promise is for everybody, because we do try to sort of lead and unify and not divide, and say that you know, I would never talk down any of the groups. I think they all do good work, and we want to help them get stronger, but we also want to help the millions of Americans come into this who haven't been involved yet, and we hope they'll join many different groups that serve them and serve this cause. So I think it's actually a good thing that we're seeing such interest in this, and people are finding ways to find expression for their work in the different groups that could do it.
I have a card here that says, this is card 1 of 2, card 2 of 2. Uh-oh. So I'll get to that in a minute, but somebody put a lot of effort into this. I should mention that Clean Elections has a project operating in 8 municipalities, headed up by Jim Herrick, to get a resolution from the city councils in order to encourage our state legislature to move. And we want our state legislature to be the 20th to ask Congress for an amendment to reverse Citizens United. So if you like to be involved in that, contact us through the website or by email, and Jim would love to hear from you. Do you see any way that campaigns could be publicly funded and corporate and individual money taken out of electioneering entirely?
Yes, I do. Actually, I think a lot of good people are trying to make that happen. It became much harder after Citizens United because, remember, the Supreme Court says we're not allowed to take individual and corporate money out of the equation. So we need that amendment so that public funding systems or democracy vouchers, small donor systems can flourish. Because now if you try to do that, you can't stop the super PACs and the corporations and the front groups from dumping money in, which both challenges the integrity of the election, so voters start believing that like their small donations don't count, and with good reason sometimes, and that public money shouldn't be used to fund such a system that is so expensive and so dysfunctional. But there are, Maine has a public funding system, Arizona has done it, Connecticut have done it. They're all under stress now because of Citizens United, but the people are trying to make it work. My friend John Pudner at Take Back Our Republic is a conservative from Alabama. He's also on our advisory council, supports this constitutional amendment. And you know, he has a perspective that conservatives tend to have, like we don't want to use public money, government money, but he gets to the same place. He calls it a tax voucher. You want to give $50 or $100 to the candidate of your choice, any candidate, then that comes off your taxes. And he says it's your money. You can use it that way. And he supports the amendment so we can keep the billionaire and corporate money out so that your $50 or $100 would actually add up to fund real campaigns in a vibrant political system. And it gets to the same place. It's public money, whether it's a tax deduction that you get for your own money, or whether there's a public financing system. I think they both, whichever way you get at it, and we could try different things in different states. Once we have this amendment, I think it shows a great deal of promise, because there always needs to be money in politics. It's not about no money in politics. It's about having it come from all of us instead of just a tiny slice of special interests.
Until we get the amendment passed, what are some ways to counter the influence of big money?
Well, we have to keep working at the amendment at the same time. It's that house metaphor. We're building the house, so we need to work on the foundation, but at the same time, we're getting those walls and windows up. And I think there's many good reforms. Ranked choice voting, as I mentioned, was passed by the voters strongly in Maine, and that allows people to vote for the candidate they really want to, instead of two horrible choices that they don't like, because they think that it'll be a wasted vote if you don't vote for the two major parties' offerings. And so it can really open up the system in an interesting way. I think I would not give up on public funding. If that's what is working of interest in your state and you can move that forward, that's another good way to give somebody who wants to run for office without being having to go to the special interests and the billionaires for their money to be able to actually run. And there's, of course, disclosure and transparency. Citizens United did not say we can't have disclosure. So we should have disclosure. We should not allow dark money in our election system. We can do that. Districting, I know it's a big topic in Minnesota as it is elsewhere. The gerrymandered districts that sliced us up into bizarre configurations based on the party's interests in keeping power rather than our interest in being represented. We have to stop gerrymandering. There's a case in front of the Supreme Court right now that comes out of Wisconsin that will consider whether it's unconstitutional, as I believe and many believe, to have the current partisan, hyper-partisan gerrymandered system in Congress. It doesn't represent the people, and it doesn't work, and it should be reversed. If the Supreme Court doesn't do that, there's actually an amendment proposal that would combine overturning Citizens United with a gerrymandering solution as well, which is, I think, of great interest. But if citizen districting commissions to take it out of the hands of the parties and the politicians and put it into the hands of nonpartisan citizen commissions or other means of drawing those district lines so we're represented better. I could go on. There's many more. I'm sure you all have good ideas too. But yes, absolutely. We work on the amendment and we work on reforms we can do now too. And I would say the amendment, I wouldn't say is some long-term thing, and these other things are short-term. They're all things that will be shorter or longer depending on how much we do, but I think we'll have all of them if we work hard at it, and things will look much better a decade from now than they do now.
Under Article 5, there's more than one way to adopt an amendment, and the only way it's been done so far is by Congress proposing an amendment and sending it to the states. There's a couple of questions here about the possibility of a constitutional convention to adopt an amendment. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so as the judge said, they're under Article 5, and I mentioned the Congress, 2/3 of Congress proposing an amendment, it then gets ratified in 38 states, or 3/4 of the states. But Article 5 also has an interesting provision that says the amendment can be proposed by a convention called by 2/3 of the states. And then that's proposed, it still needs to get ratified by the 38 states, 3/4 of the states. Now, that's never been done. All the amendments have come through Congress. So there's naturally some fear about, we've never had a convention, what would happen? People, I think we have a sort of national memory of how our Constitution was made in a way that's good, but it was also, they went to Philadelphia in 1787 for a convention and came out with a completely different government under our Constitution. And so there's concern about what if that happened in the Constitutional Convention now? What kind of amendments might we get? And so that's a good conversation and debate to have. As I said at American Promise, we're about the goal and unifying the many different paths to get to that goal. So we encourage people to learn about the concerns about a convention, but also to listen to the answers of those who are saying that Congress is so corrupted now that to get 2/3, we have to at least threaten that that convention might be called. And they have some good basis for that. The 17th Amendment, I believe it was, is how we elect senators. You may recall, senators used to not be elected by the people. They didn't face the voters. And a constitutional amendment, because the Senate was bought by special interests, said the senators are going to have to face the voters. Now, you can imagine senators that were in power under that old system didn't want to change the system and actually have to go back and face voters. But they were 2 states short of a constitutional convention to propose that amendment, and the Senate, like many people, had concerns about a convention and said, okay, we'll do it. And they voted 2/3 for the 17th Amendment. It got ratified in 38 states. So there is a good convention debate. We have that in American Promise. We have members of American Promise who are concerned and fear a convention, and we have members who support and are pushing for a convention. We think, again, that's a healthy ecosystem. We can learn from each other, and that the best solutions are everybody putting their shoulder to the wheel. And I'm pretty confident that we will have this amendment proposed by 2/3 of Congress. And whether that's because they fear a convention or whether it's because we move so fast. So if you fear a convention, I'd urge you, the best way to prevent a convention is to get it out of Congress. So don't just fight against the convention idea. Fight for a constitutional amendment that's proposed by Congress so that the convention conversation gets finished and moot. We'll then be doing ratification instead of debating a method to get there. So that's it's an important question and an important issue.
Is the U.S. the only country where corporate rights are equated to individual human rights?
Well, I'm not an international lawyer. I'm probably not qualified to do that, but I think I can say, at least in countries that consider themselves democracies, Western Europe and Canada and Australia and other countries like that, Japan, nobody seems to do it like we do. You know, it does not seem to have been a model that has spread around the world, and I think that that we can learn from countries that say, you know, we need to keep money out of elections. We need to make sure we're doing things that allow healthy, good debate in periods of time around the elections, like the UK does. But we'll do it in our way, and I think we'll find a good reform. I will say on the corporate rights issue itself, global corporate power is a concern. It is for people who run global corporations. The thing is getting so big and so international. The shareholder structures are so opaque and change literally by the second that there's really no such thing as an American corporation or a, you know, Australian corporation. They're global. And that is, I think, of concern in every country. It's a concern if you are a follower of the global trade pacts, where corporations do get significant rights and are at the table, and most citizens are not at the table in deciding what the rules will be for not just trade, it turns out, but actually how countries are able to, you know, decide whether local is important and whether it's local agriculture or other things. You can find yourself in a lawsuit in the international courts for trade with corporations claiming that, you know, our local laws are violating some global trade agreement that, you know, we might not have even been following. So corporations have great power everywhere. It is a concern. We don't want to become a corporatist oligarchy, as Jim Leach says. And I think it's like many things now, one of the stresses of democracy that is not unique to America. All of us around the world are going to have to struggle with this new thing of corporate entities that are bigger, literally bigger and more powerful than many, many countries in the world.
We sometimes hear that shareholders can control corporate contributions. Is that a realistic hope?
No.
Okay, next question.
No, it's really not. And, you know, Justice Kennedy in the Citizens United decision and Chief Justice Roberts in his concurring opinion both alluded to that, you know, that corporations can spend unlimited money And don't worry, it's not a danger to democracy because there's shareholder democracy. And the shareholders can decide whether the corporations should give the money. The reason it's not a reasonable hope is I alluded to the shareholder structures in America now. Why should a sovereign fund of Saudi Arabia, for example, which is a significant investor in lots of corporations that we know, be allowed a vote on whether money is going to pour into our local elections? That even if they did want to have that vote, which they usually don't, and aren't able to do it just as a matter of complexity of the corporate enterprise, that's not a solution because we don't want the sovereign fund of Saudi Arabia deciding who gets funded in our elections. So it's a bad idea, just even if it would work. But from Michael Porter at Harvard Business School to Professor John Coates, a corporation law professor at Harvard who's on our advisory council, to the Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, and most of the corporations are in Delaware, a man named Leo Strine, who supports this amendment work, even as he sits as Chief Justice of the most active court for corporations in the world, literally, says it doesn't work, that it's just a mirage. If you think the shareholders are going to get to have a reasonable input on where that money is going, they don't. And that's what's so dangerous, is these corporations, there's not much human control of them. They have a sort of, the CEO might be moved out, the board might change, the corporation goes on, and the money is just working in ways that advance the corporate profit. And it's just the shareholder democracy idea that Justice Kennedy had, in the words of Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, Leo Strine, was incredibly naive and wrong.
Are candidates for Congress running on this issue this year? And the questioner cites Dean Phillips in Minnesota Congressional District 3.
Well, yes, I know candidates are running. We've already received back a very encouraging response to our candidate pledge. We have draft press releases and other ways of announcing when you've taken the pledge as a candidate. We welcome all candidates of all parties to take that pledge and to run on this issue. I'm not a political operative by any means, but even I know when 85% of voters want something, it's probably a good idea to run on it. And so it's our job as citizens, though, to make sure that we speak louder than the donors are going to be speaking to those candidates. And some candidates won't be in the position that they are going to care about the big donors, and they'll want to take the pledge to support the 28th Amendment. But many candidates will feel like, oh, let me just slide through this election without really talking about this problem too much, and I'll focus on, tax cuts or anything else, but not this. We need to make them talk about this issue. This is the underlying issue for all the others. And so as citizens, let's get out there, ask candidates to take the pledge. And I think the candidates should feel like it's something they want to do. And, taking no for an answer is okay. If you get a no, just make sure your fellow voters know that that's a candidate that doesn't want to change the current system, doesn't support the amendment, and let the voters decide accordingly.
What do you offer to replace the development and funding of the system currently in place and supported by Citizens United?
The system, I think, we'll see in 10 years, as I said, will look different. It'll have a strong foundation of equal citizenship and anti-corruption principles and equal representation and integrity of elections that the constitutional amendment will provide. It will have a lot of small donors adding up to really effective and diverse campaigns. Bernie Sanders proved it, and as John Pudner reminds me, the conservative I mentioned, Donald Trump, believe it or not, proved it. He got a lot of small donors. He had an anti-corruption message that many people responded to and sent small. He had the message, and many voters responded to that for reasons that we're all here. Americans are frustrated, and I think what we can see when we can constitutionally stop the big concentrations of power that is big money, then open it up to our money. And it will take money, but a lot of small donations add up to a very healthy system, because none of the donations are drowning anybody out. None of them are big enough to corrupt the politicians or the system. So I think we'll see that. I think we will see reforms that are kind of beginning to open up the process to different, maybe third parties, or maybe certainly more debate about the range of solutions we'll have, both because of the range of funding, but things like ranked choice voting, things like ballot initiatives that are bringing new ideas in, districting that returns us to representing, our communities and the people in our communities, instead of those funny, shapes that our districts are now drawn, and your neighbor might be in a different congressional district than you. That makes it really hard to organize when you don't even know where the congressional lines are, because they've been drawn so strange, or your state lines. So I think we'll see good districting. I think we'll see good transparency. I think we'll see lots of the candidates funded by we the people, whether it's public funding or small donors. And I think we'll see an end to the domination of big money, and that will be a very healthy system. And it will not be perfect. It's America. It's a process, not an end. We'll have lots of debate, lots of different issues, lots of problems to solve, but we'll have a much better shot at solving them with that kind of a system.
You briefly mentioned the role of the media. Could you expand on their influence and their potential to influence this action?
Yes. The media is an interesting question, even what the media is in the days of social media and the internet. But I think it's to me kind of clear that the mainstream media, the kind of information we get, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or CNN, is not the healthiest way to have an informed citizenry and useful conversation and deliberation and learning about what the issues are. Now that doesn't mean that's the only media, and that's the key. I think what we're seeing right here today in this great community studio in St. Paul is exactly the kind of, this is also media, and this is the kind of thing that's going to enable us to break through the sort of, toxic narrative that drives the ratings of the big national and international mainstream media. And it's our defense against the false narratives or the false attacks on this big reform we're all trying to do, because we actually can get and trust information at the local level better now than we can on big global networks, whether social media or the TV media. Our local paper, our local television stations, our local radio stations, actually people still look to and read and listen to and talk to each other about. And so I think that is the media that we are interested in. As American Promise, I said we try to empower, support your work wherever you live. And one of the things we do is we have a communications staff, and their job, I keep reminding them, isn't to toot our horn. It's to empower you so that we provide basically a communications package and all your press contacts in your community or state when you're trying to do something. That's how Wyoming is getting 250 volunteers out there pushing for a ballot initiative on the 28th Amendment. And I swear they're in the local papers and on the local TV stations about every week or two. And all we did was give them access to the media contacts in their state, help with them do a couple of press releases, and then they know how to do it on their own, and they're off and running. So I think the media we should care about is our local media, like everything else in this sort of local organizing way that will help drive this, rather than seeing if we can get CNN or something to pay attention. They'll pay attention when we're driving towards 2/3 of Congress and ratification in 38 states. It will be the national story, a national story. So we have to build it, and then it will have a good national debate. But having that local network of media is very powerful.
Finally, here's a hard question.
All right.
How does American Promise differ from other organizations? Why should I choose American Promise over the rest?
So I think I alluded to it. We don't want you to choose American Promise over the rest. We want you to choose what is most effective for you. So check out everybody. I know I'm a member of many organizations that I think do good work. Again, I don't think it's one or another. What distinguishes us, though, is that we don't say what the amendment has to be. We don't say whether you have to do a convention or you can't do a convention. We don't say you have to have this certain ideological viewpoint or another ideological viewpoint. We are about trying to unify every American who wants this done and figuring out how we can help us get it done. And I think that's unique. And it is supportive of the other organizations, not competitive with them, because the more people we bring into this work, the more we'll see the need for local, state, national organizations. And we'll bring them all together at our National Citizen Leadership Conference. And that kind of network of organizations, a network of people in this country, is what makes it powerful. And that's what American Promise focuses on. So I do hope you'll support American Promise. And that does not mean you don't support other organizations as well.
And I should mention that American Promise works with allies like Clean Elections in order to get to the goal.
Absolutely.
Jeff, I think you've exhausted our questioners.
All right.
And thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Judge. And thank you, everybody.
And so we're going to call up Vicki Barnes for some closing comments.
While they're miking up, I'd just say a word about Vicki Barnes. She is amazing. She was, as I said, one of our first and certainly most active American Promise members in Minnesota. She has been on our national citizen leadership calls, which we have on the second Saturday of each month, mentoring and supporting other citizen leaders like her in other states. She's just terrific. And so, Vicki, thank you so much for all you do. It's a pleasure to work with you, and it's people like Vicki that give me such confidence that we're going to do this. So thank you, Vicki, and take it away.
Thank you. And thank you, Judge Beck. That was very well done. On your chairs, you have a little American Promise logo with black and white there, and these are your options for action. And on that, of course, the first is the state action. And with the two resolutions, we have one in the House and one in the Senate. Those numbers are on there, as well as the committees that they're in. And even though, as Jeff showed you, over 80% of Americans, regardless of party, agree with this amendment, for some reason, in the legislatures, both state and federal, it tends to be divided by party line. So in the past, this is, I think, the third biennium that the resolutions have been in there, but usually just gets the support from the Democratic side. So we really need to concentrate on getting the contact with our Republican legislators and let them know how important that is, that they support that as well, either as to co-author or just to support it when it gets to the floor. And we're hoping we can get it through committee to the floor for a vote. Also, local resolutions, like Jeff said, those are really, really powerful. And the best thing about it is it gives you the ability to inform and educate your community as to how damaging the influence of money is in politics. And it does go right down to school boards, all the way up to presidential elections. So it's there all over the place. You just can't always see it. And right now, American Promise in Minnesota is working in greater Minnesota in different areas out there. And we've got a great group working in Sherburne County right now. Cheryl Hogg is here. She's one of the team out there that's working hard to get a resolution passed in the county. We're working in Wright County, Meeker County, and McLeod County, and looking to go up into Stearns County and the St. Cloud area. So we are making some progress in the greater Minnesota. And thanks to Move to Amend, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Duluth all passed resolutions in their cities back in 2012 or 2013, I think. And it's been a while. There's a whole new cast of characters in the city government, so it wouldn't hurt to have them refresh that resolution. And also to maybe go after the counties, Ramsey County and Hennepin County, certainly cover a lot of area geographically and population-wise. And people always forget about county government. but they have a lot of responsibilities, and they do a lot of work, and they're a great group to get on our side as well. And this is a campaign issue. If there's a candidate that you support, you need to talk to them and tell them to make this their #1 issue. If you have a candidate in a debate or a forum saying that yes, they support the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution to get money out of politics, to return fair and equal representation to the citizens of the United States, how is the person next to him going to say, no, I'm not for that? That's just not going to work. It's pretty clear. And when the question is even asked, usually the audience will applaud because everybody is concerned about that. So use that as a campaign issue. That is a huge deal. And then spread the word. If your church can pass a resolution, Unitarian Universalists, a lot of those pass resolutions. I think there are 11 Presbyterian churches in the Minneapolis area that got together and passed a resolution. Any kind of group you're in can pass a resolution. And then also just join us. Become a member, like Jeff said. Sign up, see what's going on, get on our email list. I have a form out there if you want more information or if you want to volunteer in any capacity. The nice thing about this for volunteering is it's not really a huge commitment. It's small bursts of activity. You may get an appointment with your city council, you go meet with a council, and then that usually passes. And then you wait a little bit, you approach your county, you wait a little bit, you got the state. There'll be a series of bursts of activity, especially when it's time to push the state legislators to vote when it's on the floor. And when it's time to get your federal lawmakers to support the amendment after the state passes it and says, hey, we passed it, now we expect you to represent us. So those little bursts of activities, that's what's going to really carry this all the way through. And I'd like to just point out today, Jeff Clark is here from Move to Amend, and they've done a lot of great work, like I said, especially in this area, and they've really paved the way after the passage of Citizens United as a national group with really educating people and getting that movement going. And Paul Herman is here, who's my co-worker here with Minnesota American Promise, so he's been a lot of help and goes out on presentations with us. Jim Herrick from Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections, as George Beck mentioned, is the local resolution guy, and he says he'll go anywhere you ask him to go. So he's got all this stuff in line to help you get your local resolutions passed. And also, I cannot forget Steve Brunsberg and the SPNN studio. They have been so awesome and so supportive. They do so much great work for the local communities. All the neighborhood networks across the state do wonderful work informing and educating the local communities and showing them how you're actually still part of a global community. So they're an awesome group of people. And Jackie and Walter, who do the tech stuff, they do a great job. So thank you very much for coming. If you have any questions, you can grab me out there, and have a great Saturday. And let's go and restore the American promise of fair and equal representation to us all.